Hello students, I am Ashish Badiye, Assistant Professor at the Government Institute of Forensic Science, Nagpur. Today, I bring you an exciting and learning episode in BSc Forensic Science on an important unit, Fingerprint Part 3, Importance of Fingerprints, in which we will discuss the importance of fingerprints as evidence. We will also learn the fundamental principles of fingerprints along with the various forms of the fingerprint like latent print, patent print and plastic prints, etc. Let's start our episode with a look at what we are going to learn today. Module 1, Importance of Fingerprints. Module 2, Fundamental Principles of Fingerprints. Module 3, Forms of Fingerprints. Module 4, Fingerprints from and on crime scene. Module 5, Conclusion. Module 1, Importance of Fingerprints. A fingerprint is an impression of ridge outline which appears on the anterior surface of the proximal, middle and distal phalanges of the fingers and on proximal and distal phalanges of the thumb. These ridges are also present on the palms, soles and toes. These ridges are generally referred to as papillary or friction ridges. The ridges have a definite shape or contour and appear in numerous configurations or patterns, each possessing specific individual details by which positive identification can be made. Ridge characteristics are formed much before birth, between 3rd and 4th fetal months, and remains constant throughout life and even after death till the skin decomposes, except for growth and deep scarification. Temporary impairments in skin conditions such as warts and blisters caused by certain occupations like bricklaying, carpentry, mason work, manual labor, etc. do not generally have permanent effect, and their individual ridge characteristics revert to their natural alignment once the temporary skin condition has been corrected. In cases where the damage is irreversible due to a deep injury or scarring, the mark itself may serve as an additional identifying feature for the purpose of identification, as the size and position of such cut or injury would be highly individualistic. The common uses of fingerprints include identification of criminals whose fingerprints are found at the scene of crime, proving the presence of a person or placing a person at the scene of crime, elimination of suspects, thus narrowing down the suspect pool. In criminal identification, fingerprints are taken from across the hand to identify the person if they commit a crime in the future. Using chemical processing, forensic scientists can look at the fingerprints left behind in dirt and other substances and electronically match them to those on their databases. Identification of fugitives through fingerprint comparison. Assistance to prosecutors in presenting their case in the light of defendants' previous records. Exchange of criminal identifying information with identification bureaus of foreign countries in cases of mutual interest. Assistance to probation or parole officers and to parole boards for their enlightenment in decision making. Identification of persons and maintenance of identity records. Maintenance of service records. Maintenance of criminal records. Identification of unknown deceased persons. Recognition by the government of honored dead. Identification of persons suffering from amnesia. Identification of disaster victims. Prevention of hospital mistakes in the identification of infants. Identification of missing persons. Identification of licensing procedure for automobiles, firearms, etc. Identification of unconscious persons. In problems of mistaken identity, prevention of identity theft, establishing correct identity in cases of kidnapping, detection of bank forgeries, prevention of bank forgeries as a mark of identification on property documents, registry, stamp papers, notary, lease agreement, loan agreement, etc. And recording consent in case the person is illiterate. And recording evidence or statement of witnesses, suspects and or culprit in front of the police, magistrate or honorable court. As a mark of attendance in case of illiterates and laborers. In biometric attendance recording systems. In Aadhaar enrollment, unlocking the modern day smartphone through fingerprint sensors. One of the more modern ways of using fingerprints is to gain access to bank accounts. In the UK, the Royal Bank of Scotland and NatWest allow customers to access their online banking using fingerprints through their smartphones. In India, IndusInd Bank and Standard Chartered Bank have introduced the same recently. Module 2. Fundamental Principles of Fingerprints. Dear students, the different branches of forensic science are guided by various elementary principles, and so are fingerprints. There are three fundamental principles of fingerprints. First principle. A fingerprint is an individual characteristic. No two fingers have yet been observed to possess identical rich characteristics. The acceptance of fingerprint evidence by court has always been predicated on the assumption that no two individuals have identical fingerprints. Early fingerprint experts consistently referred to Galton's calculation showing the possible existence of 64 billion different fingerprints to support this view. The current population of the world is around 7.4 billion. Thus, the probability for the existence of two identical fingerprint patterns in the world's population is extremely rare. Second principle. Fingerprints remain unchanged throughout the lifespan, that is, permanence or persistence. Fingerprints are a reproduction of friction skin ridges found on the palmar surface of the fingers and thumbs. Similar patterns can also be found on the surfaces of the palms and soles and toes of the feet. Apparently, these skin surfaces have been designed by nature to provide our hands with a firmer grip or grasp and a resistance to slippage. A closer examination of the friction skin, preferably with a magnifying glass or hand lens, reveals a series of lines corresponding to the hills, also known as ridges, and valleys, also known as grooves. It is the shape and form of the skin ridges that one observes as the black line on an inked finger impression. Students, as we have seen in the earlier episode that once the dermal papillae develop in the human fetus in embryonic state, the ridge pattern will remain unchanged throughout life of an individual except to enlarge during growth of the limbs. Though it is not possible to change one's fingerprints, there has been no lack of effort by the criminals to damage them. Superficial cuts heals on their own, but if an injury is deep enough to damage the dermal papillae, a permanent scar will form. Such efforts at intentional disfigurement of the fingerprints can only be self-defeating, for it would be totally impossible to obliterate all the rich characteristics on the hand, unless the skin is deeply peeled off like the skin of a potato. And the presence of such permanent scars would serve as a new and additional characteristic for the purpose of identification, or rather individualization. Third principle. Fingerprints have general ridge patterns and characteristics that permit efficient classification and examination. All fingerprints are classified into four major types on the basis of their general pattern: arches, loops, whorls, and composites. These four classes form the basis for all the 10-digit classification systems presently in use. Thus, this permits for efficient classification and subclassification of the fingerprint types in a systematic manner. In routine practice, the epidermal surface of all the 10 fingers are inked and the fingerprint impressions are transferred to a standard fingerprinting sheet or card for their proper maintenance in the fingerprint files as a record for future reference and comparison. Even till date, the two fingerprints have not been found to be identical unless they are produced by the same finger of the same person. However, the individuality of a fingerprint is not determined only by its general shape and pattern type, but also by a careful examination of its rich characteristics, that is minutiae. It is the identity, number and relative position, location of the characteristics that impart individuality to a fingerprint. If two prints are compared, they will have to reveal rich characteristics that are not only identical but have the same relative location to one another in a print. In a judicial proceeding, a point-to-point comparison must be demonstrated by the expert. Module 3. Forms of fingerprint. Fingerprint or finger marks as evidence is perhaps the most frequently encountered one at the crime scene. The development and identification helps to prove the criminal's presence at the scene of crime. The various forms of fingerprint found at the crime scenes may be classified under the following three types, that is, patent fingerprints, latent fingerprints, and plastic fingerprints. Students, let us try to understand the difference between these. First, plastic fingerprints. A plastic fingerprint is a friction-ridge impression left in a material that retains the shape of the ridge detail. Plastic prints are formed when the fingers come in contact with a plastic body or surface such as soap, butter, wax, clay, soft putty, grease, freshly painted surface, and other such material that form a mold of the fingerprint when touched or pressed hard against. Although very few criminals would be careless enough to leave their prints in a lump of wet clay, this would make a perfect plastic print. Commonly encountered examples are melted candle wax, putty removed from the perimeter of window panes, and thick grease deposits on car parts. Such prints are already visible and needs no development or enhancement. These prints should not be dusted with fingerprint powders. But investigators must not overlook the possibility that invisible latent prints deposited by the accomplices may also be present on such surfaces. After photographically recording such prints, attempts should be made to develop other non-plastic impressions deposited from sweat or other contaminants. Students, I am very sure that you guys must love chocolates. Yummy, right? Try to remember the time when, specifically during hot weather, you hold the bare chocolate with your bare fingertips and you can see the patterns of your fingerprints engraved on the chocolate. That's a classic example of plastic print. I also remember the time during my childhood when we used to study and we often had power cuts. We used to light a candle. The fixing process of the candles on any surface was very interesting. The candle, after being lit, must be tilted slightly, thus allowing the flame to melt some of the wax, which in turn would fall on the surface, and while the wax is still in liquid and partially setting stage, the base of the candle must be placed in it and held still to allow it to set. The candle would burn and eventually the melted wax would drizzle along the candle to the base. While hot wax can cause burn, the fall in temperature is also quite rapid. This semi-warm, semi-cooled wax also was our toy. We used to dip our fingertips in it. After a few seconds, the wax would dry off, and on removing the layer on the inside surface, we were able to see the fingerprints in it. That's an example of plastic fingerprint. Second type is patent or visible fingerprints. Patent or visible fingerprints are chance friction ridge impressions which are visible to the human eye and which have been caused by the transfer of foreign material from a finger onto a surface. These may be formed when visible or colored contaminants are present on the fingers of the perpetrators. For example, blood on fingers may result in the formation of bloody fingerprints if any surface is touched. Likewise, an inked print, a dirt print, a color print, etc. may form patent or visible fingerprints. Some other noticeable examples would be impressions from floor and wet clay. Because they are already visible and have no need of enhancement, they are generally photographed directly for the purpose of comparison and maintenance of records rather than being lifted. Fingerprint of this kind may or may not have identification values depending upon the distinctive characteristics of the friction ridges left on the surface of the material or object touched. I hope you guys would have heard of the ill-fated bloody palm print in the infamous Arushi murder case. That was an example of visible or patent fingerprint. Third, latent or invisible fingerprints. Each skin ridge is populated with a single row of pores that are the openings for ducts leading from sweat glands. It is through these pores that perspiration is discharged and deposited on the surface of the skin. The function is to keep the hand smooth and soft. Once the fingers touch a surface, perspiration along with oils and organic matter that may have been picked up by contacting the hairy portions of the body is transferred on that surface, thereby leaving an impression of the finger ridge pattern, that is a fingerprint, also known as a finger mark. The prints deposited in this manner are invisible to the naked eyes and are commonly referred to as invisible or latent prints. The sweat glands become more active when a person is nervous or excited, and the hands perspire more than normal during this state of mind. Thus, there is an increased chance that the perpetrator of crime leaves behind his invisible fingerprint on whatever surface he touches during his act. The latent prints thus detected are converted to visible prints through any of the several available methods, like with the help of fingerprint powders and or chemical reagents, and may be photographed, lifted and preserved for later use in comparison, identification and in court trials. Latent prints may exhibit only a small portion of the surface of a finger, and this may be smudged, distorted, overlapped by the other prints from the same or from different individuals, or any or all of these in combination. For this reason, latent prints usually present an inevitable source of error in making comparisons, as they generally contain less clarity, less content and less undistorted information than a fingerprint taken under controlled conditions, and much less details compared to the actual patterns of ridges and grooves of a finger. Interesting fact: students, you must know that the first All India Forensic Science Congress held in Srinagar in 1973 recommended the following resolution regarding the minimum number of ridge characteristics to be considered for establishing positive identity. It says, the minimum number of points for establishing the identity beyond doubt in case of fingerprint examination has been fixed at 8. However, where there are 6 or 7 points of identity, a qualified opinion can be offered by the expert on his responsibility. The actual determination as to whether positive identification is achieved is dependent upon the matching of the individual minutiae or ridge characteristics. In a clear print, it is possible to locate more than 30 to 40 ridge details that can be used for comparison and establishing identity. Module 4: Fingerprints from and on the crime scene. Fingerprint evidence is undoubtedly the most reliable and acceptable evidence till date in the court of law. Each crime scene is different. According to the physical nature of the scene, the location of the evidence will also be very different. The search for physical evidence at the crime scene must therefore be thorough and systematic. What to search and where to search depends upon circumstances of crime scene. Fingerprint as evidence are generally recovered from the scene of hit and run, murder, burglary, house trespass, etc. Fingerprints are usually encountered at the point of entry or exit, on weapon of offense, any utensils like cup or glass at the scene of crime, on broken window panes, on almirah or lock surface, on mirror, on paper or any other document, fruit skin, cigarette butts, etc. The prints may be latent or patent or plastic, or a combination of these three. Due to the fragile nature of fingerprint evidences, and to avoid any possibility of them getting unknowingly damaged or destroyed during collection, packaging or transit, the development is mostly done on the crime scene itself. Following the development, photography should be done to record it, after which the lifting and preservation steps may be applied. If it is not possible to locate and develop the prints on the crime scene itself, the article or the object may be required to be transported back to the laboratory for a deeper and thorough processing. For the purpose of collection of fingerprint, the articles bearing fingerprints should be so packed that the surfaces bearing the fingerprint do not come in contact with anything. If the object is flat, it is fixed between two perforated plyboard with cork placed both above and below and fastened with nut and bolt. If object is not flat, it should be caged between two boards by a string or wire. Thermocol can be used in the place of perforated board. Module 5: Conclusion. Students, coming to the conclusion, fingerprints or friction ridges are the prime and reliable means of identification in forensic investigations and trials. The proper examination of ridge characteristics acts as a valuable tool that allows identification and individualization of person. Unless a person is involved in an accident affecting their hands or some skin diseases such as leprosy or using some specific medication like for cancer, the fingerprints remain unchanged during lifetime, except for growing in the size with age proportionately to the growth of the individual. Even after almost over a century of existence, no two fingers have been ever found to possess identical ridge characteristics. There are many established systems that permit the systematic classification of fingerprint patterns. Thank you.